A small restaurant with the beautiful name Villa Gentile had opened just a year ago, replacing a beer bar. The establishment nestled in a cosy nook, mere steps from the heart of the city. Perhaps it was its convenient location that quickly made the restaurant popular, or its delicious, varied French menu, or maybe the marketeers had earned their keep by promoting the restaurant well on social media. Whatever the reasons, the restaurant was packed every day. From Friday night through Sunday, it transformed into an anthill. People perched at the bar like sparrows, waiting for tables to open up, while others added their names to the waiting list. The waiters, bartenders and kitchen staff worked tirelessly. By shift's end, their legs and heads were buzzing. Occasional pitiful moans could be heard from the back room, or smoking room. Debbie, a fifth-year student, wasn't one to complain. Life's difficulties had hardened her early on. She'd started at the restaurant when it opened, working part-time, then stayed on as a weekend server. Debbie could proudly call herself a veteran who had weathered fire, water, corporate parties, full boarding, and other riders of the apocalypse. Oh, the things Debbie had seen. During her weekend shifts, the French restaurant transformed into something straight out of a Hollywood movie. She'd broken up fights between drunken knights, wielding chairs as swords, while competing for a giggling lady's attention. Debbie had called cabs for these inebriated souls, coaxing home addresses from them. She'd even had to explain that they didn't have karaoke, and singing into a spoon was simply mauvais. She'd witnessed a marriage proposal with a ring hidden in dessert, and breakups where betrayed partners threw sparkling wine in their cheaters' faces. Debbie was always there with a napkin and the bill for that sparkling wine. Working at the restaurant was entertaining, if challenging, but this particular Friday night proved especially difficult for Debbie. Her mood soured in the dressing room. Running late for her shift, she rushed in and quickly changed into her uniform. Just as she pulled on her polo and tied her apron around her slim waist, her mother's text message arrived. It shouldn't have been a problem, but Charlene had never typically sent motherly messages. She never asked how her daughter was doing, whether she'd eaten her soup, worn a warm hat, how her studies were going, if she was working on her thesis, if she'd found a boyfriend, or even if she was alive. No, Charlene only surfaced to test her daughter's patience, usually asking for something, typically money. This time was no different. "Debbie, my daughter," Mum began sweetly, "would you be kind enough to help your mum put some money on my card? I need to pay utilities this month. I overspent and miscalculated." Debbie wanted to reply, "Leave me alone, you nasty scammer." Instead, she closed her eyes momentarily and took a deep breath. The calming technique might have worked if her stepfather's brazen, ugly smirking face hadn't appeared behind her closed eyelids, the man who drained her mother's money like a leech. Debbie decided to postpone her response. She turned off her phone and stuffed it into her bag. Smartphones weren't allowed in the dining room anyway. The truth was, Charlene had never shown interest in her daughter's life. Their communication had always been dry, brief, and purely practical, about school assignments or household chores. Her daughter's emotional life, friendships, crushes, hobbies, free time, or food preferences meant nothing to Charlene. But unwashed dishes or an unfilled garbage bag could trigger an hour-long lecture. Debbie might have grown up completely antisocial, if not for two other caring souls, a grandmother and her kitty, Bella. They all lived in a 2-bedroom apartment, tucked away on the first floor of an old building. Sometimes Debbie, looking at her family from the outside, thought that they resembled hereditary witches. Everyone, even the cat, was red-haired, although grandmother had already turned grey. Grandma always tried to support her granddaughter. She took care of her, sincerely loved her. However, when Debbie turned 10, Grandmother was gone. It happened too sharply and suddenly. Debbie remembered how it had snowed the day before. The flakes were spinning outside the window in a waltz. Bella the cat was lying under the radiator. Grandma stood at the stove, deftly frying pancakes for breakfast. She flipped them with her fingers, and Debbie was shocked that Grandma didn't burn them. Then Grandma giggled as she taught Debbie how to braid beautiful, intricate braids. Debbie complained that the boys teased her for having such bright hair, and Grandma argued, "They just like you. Your grandfather used to pull my braids all the time, and then he confessed his love." She recalled her spouse with tenderness. Then one heart attack took and destroyed everything. Everything Debbie loved, her whole happy life. Debbie felt the loss of her grandmother deeply. It was hard for the girl to accept the loss of the only person who loved her. Strangers, neighbours and friends of her grandmother came to their apartment, comforted Debbie, stroked her head. They said comforting words, but Mum didn't comfort her daughter at all. She was busy. Debbie also remembered the strange time after the funeral, her mother's words and actions that made no sense. At the memorial table, instead of remembering her mother fondly, Charlene complained to the guests about the funeral costs. "Mum didn't even leave a penny," she lamented. Though Debbie, even as a little girl, knew that Grandma always saved money. She was saving it for Debbie's studies, the old lady had said. However, Mum took everything into her hands. After only a week, Charlene threw the cat Bella out on the street. She had never liked the animal, but the apartment had belonged to Debbie's grandmother, so Bella had been untouchable until now. "I'm not going to clean up after her or feed her. That's another expense," Charlene declared. Winter was at its peak. Debbie, learning what her mother had done, left home and walked for hours in the street, sobbing in the cold, letting the wind beat against her wet cheeks. She called for the kitty until her throat was hoarse. But Bella didn't answer. A neighbour, noticing the child's condition, brought Debbie home. Mum fussed, mumbling something about Bella escaping on her own, and then, closing the door behind the neighbour, turned on her daughter. "Why are you embarrassing me? Go to your room," demanded the mother. Debbie obeyed. In the morning, she faced even more of her mother's wrath when the mercury thermometer showed almost 40 degrees. The search for the cat had taken its toll. Mum treated her daughter nothing like grandmother had. There was no love, no tenderness, no care. Time passed, and somehow Debbie knew that when the time came, her mother would throw her out, just like the red cat Bella. And so it happened. After school, Debbie entered linguistic college on a scholarship. Debbie had thought practically, knowing that language skills would always be valuable. She could become a tutor, teacher, translator, or work in tourism. By this time, Catherine had become independent. She saw her mother as merely a roommate, not a relative. The young girl took various part-time jobs because her mother gave her no spending money. Barely 18, instead of a birthday cake, Debbie's mother brought a man into the house. Jerry was 2 years younger than her mother and had lived in a dormitory before meeting her. He worked as a loader, was bald and overweight. But Charlene fell in love with him as if he were a Turkish sheikh. Debbie, who already tried to come home only to sleep, vanished from sight. She hated sharing space with Jerry, who leered at her. He especially liked waiting for her to leave the bathroom, commenting on how nice she smelled from her shampoo. When Debbie protested, he laughed and said, They were almost family. She was like a daughter to him. Such comments made her feel even worse. Soon Charlene packed her daughter's things, opened the door to a new independent life, and wished her good fortune, saying she had fulfilled her parental duty. "You see, Debbie, you're grown up now," Mum explained. "It's time for you to be independent, or you'll never learn. But you understand the situation. I need to build my life, find my happiness as a woman. How can the three of us live in one apartment? In one room? Jerry and I are planning to marry. We need our own space, you know." Debbie didn't argue. She herself didn't want to stay near Jerry. Debbie first stayed with friends, secretly borrowing a mattress in a dormitory, then rented a place with roommates. Throughout this time, she balanced work and studies. Debbie went through several living situations before finding a tiny apartment, which she rented from a pensioner for practically nothing. The place was what people would call a shanty town, but Debbie only cared about having the basics: a desk, a shower, a refrigerator, and a bed, preferably without sharing space with cockroaches or bedbugs. Like Scrooge McDuck, Debbie saved every penny she earned, instead of spending it on clothes or cosmetics, dreaming of one day having her own place. Despite everything, Debbie rarely turned down her mother's help. Sometimes she sarcastically asked why her mother's loader couldn't pay for a new microwave or the internet bill, but then the woman fell into hysterics about raising such an ungrateful daughter. Debbie should have cut ties with her mother long ago, but she feared being completely alone in the world. This Friday evening, thoughts were already swirling in her head about giving all her tips to her mother again, because, judging by how packed the restaurant was, at least she'd have a decent amount to give. After 5 hours of intense work, Debbie was exhausted. Her calves burned and her head spun from juggling orders. Yet she maintained her smile and gave each table proper attention, never discriminating between customers like some of her colleagues did. Take Sasha, for instance, an arrogant and mercantile waitress, who once asked Debbie to look after her table. "There's some lowlife there talking nonsense. I might lose my temper," she had fumed. "And don't expect a tip. Why do people like that even come to restaurants? They should stick to burgers." Debbie entered the dining hall expecting to find an unpleasant customer. She actually liked straightforward Sasha. Perhaps the guest had harassed her because of her stunning figure. Instead, she found a handsome young man by the window. Noticing Debbie, he shyly repeated his request. "I invited a girl to your restaurant. I really like her. I wanted to impress her since this place is popular with her friends." He blushed. "But my salary's been delayed, everything's gone wrong, and I'm on a tight budget. Could you help me plan the order in advance, to make it special, but still a surprise?" Unlike her colleague, Debbie was moved by his request, especially by his reddening ears and nervous napkin fidgeting. "Tell me what your girlfriend likes. We'll make your date beautiful." She smiled warmly. That evening, Debbie went above and beyond to ensure the young man's companion enjoyed everything. She asked the kitchen to present the dishes beautifully and even got the musicians to dedicate a song to them. Her efforts paid off. The girl gazed adoringly at her date and praised his choices. Debbie added, "Yes, your companion has excellent taste. He selected some of our finest dishes." The young man looked at her gratefully. As Sasha predicted, he couldn't leave a tip, but he crafted a rose from a napkin, and that made Debbie genuinely happy. The story didn't end there. The young man returned with the same girl later. They had tea and desserts, and afterward Debbie found a generous tip and another napkin rose. This evening, however, seemed cursed. The customers were irritable, and frequently snapped at her. The final test of Debbie's patience came when two self-proclaimed queens entered. Fashionably dressed blondes, barely older than Debbie herself, who nearly grabbed her elbow as she carried another table's order. "Hey, girl!" one blonde called, pursing her bright scarlet lips. "We have a reservation in the smoking section, under name Hannah." Debbie, barely keeping hold of her heavy tray, forced a smile and promised to fetch the hostess. The blonde clicked her tongue and folded her arms across her chest, but waited patiently. Debbie prayed Hannah and her friend would be seated in someone else's section. They'd probably get along great with Sasha, but the heavenly office seemed closed to waitress's prayers that night. "Debbie, new table," Sasha shouted when the girl rushed into the kitchen. "Some airheads. They'll probably nibble on salad, nurse cocktails all night, and look for someone to pay for their tab. I need a smoke break before I spit in someone's glass." With that, Sasha left. Debbie took a deep breath, pushed through the swinging door and hurried back to the dining room. Just as Sasha predicted, the two guests each ordered a salad and cocktail. Hannah gave Debbie a cold look and demanded, "Keep the ashtray clean. I hate seeing ashes in it." Half an hour later, after 2 clean ashtrays and 2 new cocktails, the two women in the room found their target. They immediately stopped laughing like hyenas, straightened their backs, and showed off their low-cut necklines. It was obvious they had shifted into hunting mode. Debbie immediately sensed the change in their mood and, glancing over her shoulder, noticed 2 young men. They were good-looking and fashionably dressed. A blue-eyed brunette in a black turtleneck that emphasized his figure and dark jeans, and a brown-haired man in a jacket and pants. Debbie took their order for hookah, steaks and drinks, not cheap ones. The choice of dishes impressed the blondes. Perhaps they hadn't eaten anything heavier than arugula and tomatoes in ages, or maybe they were calculating the young men's wealth based on their order of Chateaubriand steak. Between the blondes' table and their targets was only a small aisle, through which Debbie shuttled like a river tram in tourist season. She noticed the girls doing their best to flirt with the young men, parading past toward the ladies' room while throwing sultry glances, biting their lips and giggling. When their first attempts failed, they decided to escalate their performance, with Debbie becoming an unwitting part of their scene. "Hey, girl!" called out one blonde, stretching the last syllable like sticky gum. Debbie, who had long joked that she needed a name tag reading "girl," since no one here used Debbie, smiled and nodded to the blonde, her whole demeanour saying, "I see you, I hear you, and I'll be there in a moment." The blonde frowned her perfect eyebrows, displeased with this response. She raised her hand and waggled her long-nailed manicured fingers, repeating louder and more irritably her call. Debbie mentally prayed again, though she had little hope for heavenly support. This is how atheists are made. Abandoning her tasks, she turned abruptly and walked toward the blondes. "Yes?" Debbie glanced at the ashtray, where a cigarette butt had just been extinguished. "I told you to change the ashtray more often." Hannah wrinkled her nose, then waved her hand. "That's not why I called you. What did you give me?" Debbie looked at the dish before the guest. On a huge plate lay pink shrimp, atop a bed of mixed salad, arugula, cherry tomatoes, avocado slices, sun-dried tomatoes and capers. The salad came with a generous portion of grated parmesan that guests could add to taste. It looked appealing, though Debbie herself wasn't fond of such salads. To her, it looked like shrimp had simply tumbled onto some vegetables. Debbie, exhausted from work and study, preferred heartier food like hot soup and beefsteak. Still, female guests loved this salad, and the sauce was excellent. "This is the Marseille salad with grilled tiger shrimp," said Debbie. "Was something not to your liking?" "I didn't like any of it." The girl raised her voice, picking at the salad leaves with her fork. "It tastes awful. The greens are stale, the tomatoes are sour, and the dressing too. Just one bite made me sick. It made my cheeks tighten." Debbie maintained her composure, though she suspected the lady's face was tight from Botox rather than the salad. She explained that she couldn't remove the plate without the administrator's approval. "I'm sorry the dish didn't meet your expectations. Let me call the administrator so we can resolve this and make it right," she offered politely. "We can either replace the dish or remove it from your check." "No, you need to take it yourself. Don't hide behind professional phrases," the blonde demanded unexpectedly. "I want you to know what you're serving to guests." "Excuse me?" Debbie asked, not quite processing the request, her hands clasped behind her back. The blonde didn't repeat herself immediately. Instead, she took another drag from her cigarette, but rather than using the ashtray, she flicked the ash directly onto the plate. Grey flakes settled like snow on the arugula. Pretending not to notice what she'd done, the blonde pushed the plate across the table. "Here, taste what you're poisoning people with. I want you to realise what slop you're serving. You're the one who recommended this salad. But what else could I expect from a waitress's taste?" Hannah's friend giggled sycophantically. Hannah stared expectantly at her red-headed opponent. Something snapped inside Debbie then, like a switch flipping. She smiled at the insolent guest. "Please forgive me, but I've never tasted slop in my life. Therefore, I can't answer your question or judge whether this salad tastes like slop. Of course, I could call the administrator, another waitress, or the cook. However, I don't think any of our staff have experience with slop. You're clearly the only expert on that matter, but we trust your judgment." Debbie squeezed her fingers behind her back more tightly, fighting the urge to use her fists. She was always patient, sweet and friendly. But Debbie, no matter how bad the conditions, never considered herself a second-class person. She wasn't going to let an arrogant blonde walk all over her just to impress a guy and flaunt her status. Meanwhile, the guys behind Debbie's back laughed. The brown-haired one even clapped his hands a couple of times, delighted with the waitress's response. Hannah blushed, her face twisted with anger. She threw the cigarette onto the plate and jumped up, towering over Debbie by about 10 centimetres. "How dare you! Call the administrator here! No, the manager! You won't work here any more!" Debbie was about to fulfill the request when suddenly the blonde's gaze shifted from her face to somewhere behind her. The girl instantly became flustered, shrinking back as an uncertain smile appeared on her lips. "Oh, you decided to interfere." She tucked a strand behind her ear. "You shouldn't have. You see, sometimes people need to be told where they belong, but I'm used to it." Debbie looked over her shoulder and saw a brunette in a turtleneck. He stood next to her, measuring the blonde with his gaze. "Yes, I decided to intervene. I can't ignore this situation. As it happens, I'm the son of the restaurant manager. My father, Henry Toffler, opened it not long ago. It's only been a year. I sometimes come to check how things are going." He grinned. "And you, I take it, often put on such performances?" The blonde blushed and started fidgeting with her hair again. "Not really. Don't bother explaining. He nodded at the table. Please pay the bill and leave the establishment. I won't allow you to insult my employees. If you disagree, we can call the police. You are welcome to take your uneaten salad with you. Hannah's face went slack. She stared at the guy in shock while he calmly held her gaze. You know what? Fine, we're leaving. I'll never set foot in here again. Come on, Claire. She threw money on the table and, grabbing her bag, stormed out. Her friend followed. The guy looked at the discarded bills. Is it enough? He asked. If not, I'll cover the rest. Debbie looked at the brunette with surprise and scepticism. I'm sorry, but thank you for your help. But who are you? Our manager's name isn't Henry, and he has a child, though her name is Molly. You don't look like a Molly. That's because you haven't seen me in braids and a skirt. The brunette laughed, then extended his hand. I'm Todd. I just wanted to help you, Debbie. I couldn't sit by and watch. So you just lied to them? Debbie muttered, unsure how to respond. She took his hand timidly. She noticed that he had used her name after seeing it on her name tag. Somehow that small detail made her feel warm inside. I confess, Todd tilted his head in an endearing bird-like way. Should I bring them back and apologize? A strand of his thick hair fell over his eyes. Debbie felt herself blush. No, you don't need to. Thank you, she said again. The conversation couldn't continue, as Sasha brought her colleague back to reality, pointing out that other guests needed attention. Debbie resumed her duties, floating through the hall like a busy bee, but her gaze kept drifting to the two young men, especially Todd. When Debbie's shift was ending, Todd approached her again. Debbie, may I walk you home? He asked straightforwardly. Debbie, without playing coy, smiled and nodded. You can. Though it'll be quite a walk. I live... Debbie was about to say something like, at the end of the world or in the middle of nowhere, paused and lowered her eyes. I live rather far away. Then we're lucky I have a car. Todd smiled broadly. Sasha, hearing this, was thrilled for her friend. Though she could be difficult at times, she was still sincere and good-hearted. How fortunate! I've noticed these guys before, even caught their eye. Such gentle and handsome men, she said, applying lipstick to Debbie's lips and spritzing her neck with expensive perfume. Just text me his license plate number, okay? And let him know I'll know exactly where to look if you don't show up for work. Thanks. Now I definitely feel lucky, Debbie laughed, waving her off. If you end up in his bed, text me too. You can write at night. Give me a live update, Sasha teased, giggling. Debbie, blushing, insisted that wouldn't happen. After all, she wasn't that kind of girl. Yet a couple of hours later, she found herself lying in Todd's bed, remembering Sasha's words and wondering if she should message her. The story of how Debbie ended up in Todd's apartment wasn't romantic at all. When Todd drove Debbie home, she discovered strangers inside. Her belongings were packed in bags and left in the hallway. Debbie, I've been calling and calling, but you haven't answered. The landlady, who was still there despite the late hour, mumbled apologetically. I turned my phone off at work. I forgot to turn it back on. What's happening? Debbie demanded, staring at her modest possessions. My relatives have come to visit. I can't throw them out on the street. They're family. And there's a small child. They need their own space. But how can you throw me out? Debbie gasped. I paid you in advance. I'll return your money. I'm honest, I don't want to keep what isn't mine. The old woman reached into her stained robe pocket, pulled out crumpled bills, and thrust them at her bewildered tenant. Here, take it. We didn't have a contract, so I'm sorry. Check your things, but we've packed everything." Debbie knew she could make a scandal, but what was the use? She had been thrown out of the house like a dog, again. One could get used to it. "It's night time. Where do I go?" she asked dejectedly. "Here, sleep at your boyfriend's place," the old woman suggested, nodding behind Debbie's back. The girl had forgotten that Todd had decided to walk her to the door. She blushed deeply, imagining what he must think of her. However, the brunette simply shrugged his shoulders. "Let's go. I've got plenty of room." The guy grabbed her bags and carried them to the car. The dazed girl scrambled to follow. "No, what are you doing? You can't do that," she exhaled. "You can't spend the night on the street. The cops will pick you up. You'll get a hotel room behind bars with a view of a life of crime," he grinned, arranging the bags in the trunk. "Is this all your belongings?" "Uh-huh," Debbie nodded. "I'm kind of in favour of aestheticism." He snorted, slamming the trunk shut. "Well, Debbie, get in. Now you're going to see me off," Todd smiled. "And don't worry, things happen in life. My mother taught me to help whenever possible. She spent our whole childhood bringing home stray cats and dogs, caring for them and finding them homes. I have the means to help you. There are 2 rooms in the apartment, and the bathroom locks from the inside. I can't lock your room, but you can move the closet if it makes you feel safer." Debbie hummed nervously, but meekly returned to the cosy interior of the foreign car. Until the last moment, she couldn't believe she had agreed to spend the night with a stranger. Was she expecting a catch? Perhaps, but there was none. Todd gave her clean linens so she wouldn't have to search for her own, showed her where she would sleep, and pointed out the bathroom and kitchen. "Help yourself to anything, don't be shy," Todd said. "I'm going to bed, okay?" Debbie didn't immediately realise that Todd had gone to sleep in the living room, giving her his bedroom. She thought she wouldn't be able to sleep a wink in someone else's bed, but Debbie was so exhausted that after her shower she fell asleep immediately. And in the morning, all hell broke loose. "Who are you? And what are you doing in my boyfriend's bed? Are you his mistress? And this, after I gave birth to his son and daughter?" Debbie's eyes flew open as she sat up abruptly, so quickly that stars danced before her eyes. When they cleared, she focused on a stately, gorgeous brunette woman in a classic suit, standing with arms crossed over her chest. "Oh, my God! I'm sorry, you've got it wrong," wailed a sleepy Debbie. "Todd was just helping me out. I had nowhere to sleep for the night. I had no choice, so I came to his place. He slept in the other room. Honestly." Debbie rambled excuses, alternately blushing and paling, not noticing that the girl before her was barely containing her laughter. Then the door opened, and a surprised Todd appeared, wearing a flowered apron. "Stacy, what are you doing here? I told you not to wake the guest." He frowned, brandishing a kitchen spatula. "Come on, I've always dreamed of playing the wronged wife," Stacy giggled, fixing her hair. She turned to the bewildered guest with a broad smile. "What do you think? Did I pull it off? I want to be an actress," she shared, climbing onto the bed without ceremony. "So far, you've only succeeded in giving me a headache," Todd muttered. "Debbie, don't mind her. Sorry about the theatrics. This is my little sister. We were supposed to meet later." "Hi, Debbie. Todd never brought girls home for breakfast before. Dinner, yes, but breakfast?" the sister prattled, teasing her brother. "Stacy, go eat your pancakes," Todd commanded. "Keep that chattering mouth busy." His sister, still grinning, bounced off the bed and headed to the kitchen. Only then did Debbie notice the smell of fresh pancakes. Her stomach growled. "Come on, Debbie. Sorry, I asked her to let you sleep." Todd shrugged. "But when do little sisters ever listen?" "It's okay," Debbie replied softly, oddly shy about meeting her host's eyes. 10 minutes later, she sat at the table between the siblings. After another 10 minutes, her full belly ached from constant laughter. Soon after, Debbie felt completely at ease in their company, as if she'd known them all her life. Stacy had helped dispel any morning awkwardness between Debbie and Todd. Debbie learned that Todd had worked as an architect in his father's company for 2 years, while Stacy studied at theatre school. Debbie could tell they were a wonderful family. Todd cared deeply for his little sister, she adored him, and their parents clearly loved them both. When the siblings prepared to leave for their commitments, Stacy took Debbie's hands in hers. "Don't leave, okay? I'll be back this evening. Stay at Todd's for now." Todd nodded, handing her a set of keys without hesitation. "Take whatever you need here, okay?" Debbie nodded shyly, and she did follow that advice. After a while, Debbie took what she wanted most, Todd's heart. Todd and Debbie, whose relationship began with cohabitation, fell deeply and tenderly in love. Todd admitted he had noticed the charming red-headed waitress before, but never found the courage to approach her. With Todd, Debbie found the loving family she'd always dreamed of. They even got a cat, a beautiful ginger girl who reminded them of Bella. Todd's mum had found the kitten on the street. And Debbie's mum? Eventually her daughter stood up to herself, explaining she had long ago fulfilled her duties as a daughter. Debbie left her past behind. She wasn't alone anymore. She was surrounded by people who truly loved her. Who would have thought that all it took was standing up to one rude customer? Who knew?